discussing brain structure. Just the basics. You'll dig into this in a lot more detail when you get to anatomy. But for physiology, we do need to have at least a basic understanding of what structures we're talking about. We can't understand the physiology if we don't have a handle on the basic anatomy. So talking about the structure of the brain, and then we'll talk about protection of the brain. And then we'll talk about what's going on with the neurons and the neuroglia. Okay, so when we're looking at a brain, we typically think of it kind of like this. We're imagining what these are these dips and folds in the outside of the brain. And this is one of the most critical parts of the brain where so many important functions happen, but we're going to start in a different place. If we were to take the brain and we were to cut it down the middle, right down the center, there's like that furrow down the center of the brain between the two, what are called hemispheres, and we were to cut those apart and look right in the middle of the brain. This is what we're looking at now. And we're going to start down here at the bottom of this image. At the bottom of the image is where we sort of left off. Let me, oh, hang on. There we go. Okay, so this is where we left off because the last thing we talked about was the spinal cord. Moving up from the spinal cord is an area of the brain called the brain stem. A good way to do that. So this area of the brain, just superior to the spinal cord, is called the brain stem. Brainstem. Important structures in the brainstem are the pons and the medulla oblongata. The pons is the little bump, and the medulla oblongata is just inferior to the pons. So this is the brainstem. And right now we're just sort of reorienting ourselves to things that we're probably already familiar with. Pons and medulla oblongata. Then in this image to the right of that, is that how you're, yeah, okay. I want to make sure it wasn't flipping. We have the cerebellum. So the cerebellum, what color should I use? Is this little thing right here. And the cerebellum almost kind of looks like it's its own little brain. And the cerebellum is critical to the coordination of movement. So if someone experiences damage to their cerebellum, they're going to have trouble coordinating their muscle movement. So their motor coordination is going to become problematic. Okay, moving up a bit further into the brain, we have couple of structures that are hopefully really familiar. Right here, I don't know if you can see that yellow outlining. I hope you're like, oh, I totally know what those are. That's the hypothalamus and the pituitary. The pituitary. And then just superior to that, this sort of bulb here is the thalamus. Hypothalamus and pituitary, which are hopefully very familiar, and then just superior to that again is the thalamus. Then we have this sort of like little structure that looks like a loop. This is the corpus callosum. I'm going to change my color again. What colors have I not used? Oh, we'll just use black. Okay, then here, this sort of like hooked structure is the corpus callosum. And then the area that's gray, which I mentioned earlier, is the area that most people are probably familiar with. Let's see if we can use a different color. So all of this gray sort of wrinkly area is the cortex. And the cortex is the seat of what we call higher brain function. So this is just orienting you, giving you a couple of places to grab a hold of when it comes to the structure of the brain. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you the big categorical names for each of these areas. So what are these, the brainstem and the pons, the medulla oblongata, the cerebellum, what are the names that you're going to see like in the book, or general areas for those names? So the pons, medulla oblongata, and cerebellum, if you take those three together, those three structures, pons, medulla oblongata, and brainstem, I think I'm going to erase all of this. Okay, if you take those together, pons, medulla oblongata, and cerebellum, sorry I keep saying brainstem, but that's true. Pons, medulla oblongata, and cerebellum all together are often referred to as the hindbrain. Okay. These are the mesencephalon and myelencephalon together make up the hindbrain. This is the sort of, I don't know, shorthand is what way that you'll hear it referred to. Together, the hypothalamus and the thalamus form the diencephalon. And then we already talked about the cortex, which is its own structure. It's this area is often referred to as the cerebrum, or the cerebral cortex is probably the way that you're used to seeing it. Okay. If we dig sort of into another middle part of the brain, deep in the brain, is this other important part that we'll talk about called the limbic system. The limbic system. And the limbic system is the center of emotions. A lot of memory hangs out in the limbic system. If the limbic system is damaged, then people have a lot of problems with memory. And the parts of the limbic system, which I always think the drawings of it look really cool, and I'm like, I wonder if that's what it really looks like. Okay, so you have the hippocampus, which is all one word, but I didn't have enough room to write it. The amygdala, Have you guys figured out that I can't spell? Amygdala. Okay, you've got the amygdala, the hippocampus, the mammillary body, which is up here, this little thing. And then, right here, the cingulate gyrus. And this is the limbic system. And like I said, the limbic system is critical for emotion and memory. And as we're just overviewing right now, and we'll come back to these. Okay, the cortex, or the cerebral cortex, as you're familiar with, is divided into lobes. And this is probably something you've seen many times before. We have the frontal lobe, the occipital lobe, the temporal, or the parietal lobe, and then the temporal lobe. Okay, and different functions live in these different areas. So that's just basic overview, so we can orient ourselves to kind of where we are in the brain. And now we're going to step through and dig a little bit deeper about different things that are happening, functions, particularly, hopefully, getting into physiology of the brain.